forgiven for thinking that badge engineering was a modern phenomenon in the car world, but in actual fact, car makers have been doing it for decades. And while Daimler purists might have lamented Jaguar's takeover of the brand back in 1960, the truth is, come the late 1950s, Daimler was on its knees. It had no budget to develop new models, and the then owners BSA, who had owned the brand since 1910, had clearly made it apparent that they wanted out. Fortunately, Jaguar, under the reins of Sir William Lyons, the company founder, desperately wanted to increase its production capacity. So Daimler's Radford factory, and indeed its reputation for excellent engineering, came at just the right time. It was quite an opportune purchase. And the story goes that the feedback Daimler had from some of its dealers was that to ensure Daimler's future success, what it really needed was a compact luxury saloon. So, once Jaguar took the reins, they decided to take the 2.5 V8 engine that Daimler had been developing and shoved it in the front of the Mark I saloon, as it was, that had been introduced in 1955, then paired it up with a Borg-Warner automatic gearbox. They managed to introduce the Daimler 250 V8 saloon in 1962, this time in the, effectively, a rebadged Mark II version of the Jaguar saloon. It looked very similar to the Mark II, with the same curvaceous body shell, but it had the distinctive crinkle cut Daimler grille, a flying D badge on the bonnet and similar Daimler scripting on the boot and on the hubcaps. But with that 2.5 V8 engine and automatic gearbox, it bestowed the car with a completely different character to the Mark II on which it was based. The engine itself is some 50 kilos lighter than the straight 6XK engine, and the automatic gearbox gives it a much more sedate, sort of genteel feel rather than the sporting saloon pretensions of the Mark II. In every other regard, it's the same car. It's still got the double wishbone coil sprung suspension up front, leaf sprung, live rear axle, but that V8 engine, well, I mean, I'm a big fan of the XK straight 6 engine. I think it's still one of the best engines ever made by anyone, let alone just Jaguar. But this V8 engine is astonishing. It's fantastic.
Inspired by the simplicity of a Cadillac V8 engine, Daimler engineer Edward Turner used a pushrod overhead valve system to keep design costs to a minimum, while also enabling him to base the design of the cylinder head on those he'd already developed for Triumph motorcycles. The 90-degree V8 engine has part hemispherical combustion chambers with 2 overhead valves per cylinder. Aluminium alloy pistons with steel connecting rods run in a cast chrome iron block with sandcast high tensile light alloy heads and crankcase housing a crankshaft carried on 5 bearings. There's a separate exhaust system for each bank of cylinders. Light alloy is used for the valve covers, tappet blocks, sump and inlet manifolds. This compact and lightweight V8 bestowed the Daimler saloon with refined performance significantly different to the character of Jaguar's 6-cylinder XK engine.
It's got a lovely deep roar. The V8 engine has got 140 horsepower and 155 pounds-feet of torque, but with that auto gearbox, it's not exactly rapid. It'll accelerate to 60 in just shy of 14 seconds. That must have still felt pretty quick back in the early 60s, mind. It just lacks a sense of urgency, I suppose, because of that automatic gearbox.
Our friends at Lancaster Insurance are running monthly giveaways. You can win all sorts, from experience days to tools, restaurant vouchers and tech. So click the link below at the end of the video to enter their latest competition.
Inside the car, it's a little bit different from the Mark II. We've got this full-width bench seat rather than 2 separate seats, so the centre console has been ditched. I love the traditional fascia of Jaguars and Daimlers of this era. The bank of auxiliary gauges in the middle, all these toggle switches, like you're piloting some World War II aircraft. And there's plenty of room in here. This curvaceous roofline gives you acres of headroom, even for someone of Joe's size, for example. And dispensing with any centre console gives a real sense of space in here. It went on sale in 1962, priced at £1,786, just over £100 more expensive than the equivalent 3.4 Mark II. So it was very consciously pitched as the flagship model. The car was generally well received by the press and the public alike, and for Jaguar, having the Daimler badge was a real marriage of convenience. Jaguar was still very much about new money, new wealth, a more modern brand, whereas Daimler was more traditional. Jaguar's sort of rival to Rolls-Royce and Bentley, if you like. In September 1967, it was rebadged the Daimler V8 250 to coincide with rebadging of the Jaguar saloons. Rather than being called Mark II, became the Jaguar 240 and 340. And from then, they just soldiered on replaced ultimately in 1969, by which time Jaguar had introduced its groundbreaking Series 1 XJ, and the Daimler badged equivalent of the XJ6 Series 1 was introduced, and therefore rendering this somewhat irrelevant. So in its 7-year production life, it actually only really shifted just shy of 18,000 units. That's a paltry sum really, but its sales success was always going to be hampered by the fact that they didn't sell the Daimler derivatives in its key market of North America. But consequently, it does make the Daimler quite a rare thing, and there's certainly no denying the appeal of that engine. The Mark II feels definitely sportier, it's got much more rapid performance. This feels quite solid, quite refined. If you put your foot down, the engine roars. This massive steering wheel, it's like you're driving a ship, and frankly the handling is not dissimilar. It's a little bit rolly and there's very little feel coming through the steering. The brakes are quite dead as well. But again, I wouldn't treat this car as anything other than a luxury saloon to take a sedate drive in rather than tear around B roads. You're more likely to be on your best behaviour in something like this, whereas the Mark II has an element of being something of a hooligan. And there's no denying the distinctive lines of this body shell. Of course, it was immortalised with the 240 saloon that appeared in Inspector Morse. In fact, when we were shooting the statics for this, a couple came into the car park and said, "Is that a Jag?" not realising the Daimler badges. Shows how subtle the badge engineering really was. But for those in the know, this was a proper Daimler. It lived up to the Daimler image of being a little bit under the radar, discreet, civilised. So while some people might just see this as nothing more than a badge engineered Mark II, I think it's got more about it than that. The fact that it's running its own distinct Daimler power unit does give it a character of its own. And of course, by the time this was replaced by the Daimler equivalent of the XJ, Daimler had just become a badge engineering exercise. At least with this, it had its own Daimler engine. Even Jaguar struggled to know what to do with Daimler after that. Just threading it along this country lane here, it's actually lovely. It's a bit floaty. I'm just here to enjoy the drive. It feels completely composed. It's never going to step out of line. And the ride is supple. You're always aware of that engine throbbing away up front. Acceleration is instant, if a little sedate. It feels more leaden than the Mark II, but it's no worse for that. If anything, it just gives it a really solid feel. It feels like it's good quality. I like the fact that it hides its light beneath the bushel somewhat. I've always been a fan of Jaguars, as you probably know, but I've always liked Daimlers too, and this Daimler 250 V8 is an absolute delight.
This video is proudly sponsored by Lancaster Insurance. Give them a call on 01480 400 889 for an insurance quote on your classic car. And don't forget to click the link below to enter their latest competition.